All right. Professor Tatum in the house once again, here for yet another lecture for History 1302. In our last lecture, we looked at the American South during the process of Reconstruction and into the early years of Jim Crow, kind of saw the rise of a modern American South. Now we're going to mosey on over to another region of the country during this same period and see what's happening in the American West in the years after the Civil War, right, in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And we'll go ahead and start out by looking at the West Coast. We'll primarily be looking at California in this lecture because they're the biggest on the West Coast, the easiest to pick on. But to understand this was happening throughout the West Coast and in regions a little further inland as well. We're going to see a lot of what was happening in terms of race relations in the West Coast is very similar to what we saw with race relations in the American South in this same period. All right. But we'll look at here's a little context as usual. We'll look at some continued anti-Chinese sentiment that continued into the late 1800s, and then we'll look at some anti-Chinese legal restrictions placed in this same period. So the first real big boom in Chinese population occurred with the gold rush. All right. So when gold was discovered in California, people began rushing there not only from all over the United States, but really from all different parts of the world to try to get access to some of that gold. And a large number of people did come there from China. And a lot of these Chinese workers and their families who eventually came and settled with them in many cases faced a great deal of nativism. All right. Nativism is a term we need to be familiar with. This refers to this ideal backed by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant individuals who see themselves as the creme de la creme, prime example of what it means to be a native-born American. And nativists considered anybody who did not fit their white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mold to be a threat to their existence and to their place in U.S. society. So when they started seeing this increased population of Chinese people, they began responding with extensive discrimination against Chinese communities. And as we'll see moving forward, Chinese people were frequently used as scapegoats during times of economic hardship, all right? When really there's all kinds of bigger systemic issues at play causing economic hardships, it's a lot easier to just look at a person who looks a little different and say, you must be the cause of these problems. I'm going to blame it all on you. We certainly don't see that anymore in the 21st century, now do we? That's sarcasm. After the gold rush, many Chinese people chose to stay in the U.S. Many of them did work on the railroad. Other common industries that Chinese communities got involved in included laundries and the cigar industry. Very thankful for that. But despite these stereotypes and the fact that these were kind of common industries that many Chinese people did get involved in, we need to understand that these are communities of people, all right? And they had all the different types of businesses and services that you would expect any community of people to have, all right? They had stores, they had restaurants, they had all that jazz. These are just some of the common industries that Chinese migrants are known to have been involved in. And in these post-gold rush years, and definitely even after the Civil War, more and more people began to migrate to the U.S. from China. And as many of them came to the U.S., many of them began to have families, which led to the birth of many Chinese American children being born in the United States by the late 19th century. I never really know specific dates or specific numbers for our class. I'd rather that you know what those numbers tell us, all right, and what those dates might tell us about a particular general time frame and what's going on there. All right, so here we're looking, of course, at this post-Civil War period, late 1800s, and we can see that within the span of 10 years in that period here, all right, between 1870 and 1880, there was a big boom in Chinese population. All right, we saw a jump from somewhere around 50,000 Chinese people living in California by 1870 to an estimated 200,000 Chinese people living in California by 1880. All right. Again, I don't care you know those specific numbers. What I want us to understand is that within 10 years here, there's a massive boom. That's like 4 times as many people of Chinese descent now living in California within just 10 years. Okay, with all this in mind, we need to keep in mind our big Unit 1 themes going on here of recognizing the Civil War as a metaphorical Second American Revolution and understanding that throughout this period of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the U.S. is being reconstructed as a modern American nation. So what race relations look like here will say something about that modern America as a whole. There was certainly continued anti-Chinese sentiment into the late 1800s as well. And to really understand this, we're probably going to have to use some empathy without necessarily having sympathy. I've talked about that in earlier videos and stressed that that is a crucial skill to have to really be successful in studying history. So what we need to do here is not necessarily agree with or support the views of people who discriminated against Chinese people by any means, but we do need to try to understand where they're coming from, what kind of arguments they're making, and understand their justifications for their actions. Okay. So Chinese workers were viewed as unfair competition by many workers of other ethnicities, not only white workers. Many Latino workers, as we'll see moving forward, also had issues with Chinese workers in California, but many of them did work for lower wages. All right. And I want to clear up this stereotype that people have of immigrants coming in and wanting to work and being willing to work for lower wages. All right. And it's the fact that they're coming in willing to work for so dirt cheap because their lives are so miserable and they're willing to have anything slightly better. No, these Chinese workers would go on strike. They would try to push for higher wages. They wanted better working conditions, but this is all that their employers would be willing to pay them, all right? And they would find different ways to justify paying them less. But the fact stood that Chinese workers were being paid less than other workers in most cases, so employers were more likely to hire Chinese workers because they could justify paying them lower wages, all right? So the large Chinese presence contributing to cheaper labor got combined with other fears that people had in this same period. As we'll see moving forward, in this post Civil War period, late 1800s and early 1900s, there was also a big boom in industrialization and a rise in industrial capitalism. And one byproduct of that rapid industrialization was that businesses began trying to find ways to lower their costs, in many cases by decreasing their dependency on skilled labor. Okay, so they began as much as possible cutting out skilled laborers from the workforce and breaking up their tasks into very simple tasks and dividing them up. In other cases, they would try to replace workers with machinery as much as possible. And another alternative, as we see here in California, was to replace them with cheaper labor, right? By collectively agreeing to pay certain demographics of people less and using them as much as possible in place of white male workers. So this led to a big fear by white male workers that they were all going to be kicked out of the workforce and replaced by all these other groups of people. And here they're kind of seeing that come into play somewhat as businesses are more frequently hiring Chinese people to do things like work on the railroads. This is for many of them confirming that fear that they have that they're being pushed out of the workplace. And they kind of start to see this all as some big collective action against them, perhaps. And individuals who held a great deal of anti Chinese sentiment, as well as many of those who were consumed by those fears of Chinese laborers pushing them out of the workforce, began to form organizations known as anti-coolie clubs, right? So the word coolie, we need to understand, was a derogatory term toward anyone of Asian descent. And these anti-coolie clubs are organizations of workers of other ethnicities, not always white workers, but mostly, who would collectively try to undermine Chinese communities and especially the influence of Chinese labor. So these groups would work together to do things like harass and intimidate Chinese workers, distribute anti-Chinese propaganda, like that seen here. But they also led collective boycotts against Chinese goods, Chinese labor, Chinese businesses. They also, very unfortunately, in many cases, carried out mass violence against Chinese communities. So, violence against Chinese people, absolutely something we need to grapple with here. It was very commonplace by the late 1800s. This was intensified during times of economic hardship because remember, Chinese people were frequently blamed for hard economic conditions. There were, of course, much bigger systemic issues at play. We can certainly see that looking back in hindsight. But in the moment, it's so much easier for people to just say, well, there's this large presence of people here who seem a little different than us, who are working for lower wages, even though they really don't want to be. Let's just blame them. They must be the problem. And then people would kind of share this idea with each other that the true problem of their hardships was this big population of Chinese people, and that the solution to their hardships was to just reduce the number of Chinese people to undermine their influence in American society. Again, this is nothing we see in the 21st century now, is it? We've grown so much further than this. We have developed such a consciousness that we know to learn from our history. Bullshit. But I do want to show a couple examples of this mass Chinese violence, okay? One we can look at is the Los Angeles Massacre. So before I go on with this example, I like to always kind of give an analogy here, okay? So I grew up in a neighborhood where there was always some gang activity. I never felt unsafe by any means. My family never felt unsafe. We never got robbed, anything like that. But it was very clear who was involved with some kind of things in the neighborhood. And I'm not talking little bullshit gangbanger kids wearing baggy pants, listening to rap music, thinking they're badasses. I'm talking straight up dudes doing the kind of thing criminal organizations do. Again, never felt unsafe, anything like that, but they were certainly there in the neighborhood. I had a good friend growing up whose mom was from Mexico. He never had a real positive male influence in his life. And as kids, we were good friends. We'd go hang out at each other's houses. We'd go ride our bikes together around the neighborhood, have fun together, you know. And then as we got a little older, he started looking for that male influence he never had in some of the people in the neighborhood, I guess, as well as some people he was meeting at school. And he got kind of mixed up with the wrong crowd. And next thing you knew, by the end of middle school, we were never really talking anymore. And then by the time I was in high school, I kind of heard that he was caught up in some illicit activities that he was making a profit from. We'll keep that at that. And then by the time I was graduating high school, he was in prison for shooting somebody down the street. All right. So, what does all that say about me as a person? Does the fact that I grew up in a neighborhood where there is some criminal activity, okay, where some people get involved with things like that, very unfortunately, does that speak about me as an individual? Should I be held responsible for the actions taken by some of the people in my neighborhood who unfortunately got caught up in those kinds of activities? Right? Should I be held accountable for, say, for example, my buddy I grew up with making that choice to shoot somebody down the street? No, that's fucking absurd, right? Well, unfortunately, we don't always have that kind of mindset. Sometimes people start to compartmentalize that, okay, there's one bad apple in this neighborhood. Everybody there must fit this same category. And we'll use that as justification to do ugly things to all these people who are part of this community or part of this neighborhood or whatever. So what we need to understand that happened here is there was a feud between a couple of very prominent Chinese gangsters. It got real violent. There was some gunfire back and forth, and a policeman in the community and a popular bar owner who was a vigilante went to respond to this gunfire between these Chinese gangsters. All right. And when they showed up, they got caught in the crossfire, and one of them ended up getting killed. The other one was shot and severely injured. And understandably, I'd say, the Los Angeles community was pretty upset to hear this. But instead of trying to figure out who the individuals responsible were, they kind of jumped to the conclusion that the reason this happened is because those gangsters are Chinese. And the entire Chinese community must be polluted and corrupted. That's the true cause of the problem here. And people started spreading this idea around their community. And before you knew it, there was a mob of somewhere around 500 white and Latino Californios uniting together to carry out this pogrom against Chinese communities. All right. They stormed through Chinese communities, destroying property and committing mass violence. And by the end of all of this, that mob had killed nearly 10% of the city's Chinese population. Very, very devastating. Another example we can see just a few years later occurred in San Francisco. So this started with something completely unrelated. Right? There was a rally being held by some workers, as we'll see moving forward. It was not uncommon for workers to come together and rally together and push for things like improved working conditions and better pay in this period. And that's exactly what they were doing. All right, there were a lot of labor unions involved with this rally, trying to support the common good of workers. But then members of anti-coolie clubs kind of infiltrated this rally, and they began going around the crowds, convincing people, you know why you're going through all these hardships at the workplace? You know why you're having to sit here and push for better pay? It's because of those Chinese coming in. They're taking all our jobs and they're making our lives miserable. They're, of course, the cause of our economic hardship. Again, we need to remember there are much bigger systemic issues at play, but it's a lot easier to just blame the person next to you who looks a little different. And that's very unfortunately what this mob of people did here. All right. They were convinced by the anti-coolie clubs that the cause of their discontent was the growing Chinese presence in California. So many members of this mob got together and led a 3-day assault against Chinese communities. Again, vandalizing and destroying Chinese businesses, also injuring and killing even some Chinese people. And there were several altercations that broke out between these rioters, community members, and police. And several people were injured and even killed in those altercations. So this is very much a reality of life for Chinese people on the West Coast in the late 1800s. This extensive discrimination and violence, all right? But violence was not the only place that this discrimination was manifested. Citizens of California also tried to place legal restrictions against Chinese people in the United States as well. So let's look, for example, to some clauses that were proposed to be put in California's state constitution. By the late 1870s, California was in the process of writing a new state constitution. And this is during the time, as we saw, when anti-Chinese sentiment was growing rampant. And some people wanted to include clauses in the state's constitution that placed blatant restrictions on Chinese peoples and other people of Asian descent. So here were some proposed clauses that people wanted to place in the Constitution. All right, one proposed clause read, and I quote, "No native of China, no idiot, insane person, or person convicted of any infamous crime shall exercise the privilege of an elector in this state." No native of China, no idiot, insane person, or person convicted of any infamous crime shall exercise the privilege of an elector in this state. So this clause is making some serious suggestions here about people of Chinese descent, right? It's clumping them together with idiots, insane persons, as well as people convicted of any infamous crime. This is kind of suggesting that any person of Chinese descent must either be idiotic or insane or be a criminal. And this is placing a very clear restriction of forbidding people of Chinese descent from being able to vote. All right, another proposed clause barred, I quote, any Chinese or Mongolian from working on any state or local public works project. All right. So public works projects are paid for, wait for it, by the public. And by preventing any Chinese or Mongolian, as they say, from working on these types of projects is ensuring that there's no public taxpayer money funding Chinese labor. These clauses were not implemented, all right? Federal courts reviewed these when the state proposed their constitution, and they said, no, this is a load of malarkey and a blatant violation of things like the 14th Amendment. You cannot do this. But we need to understand the fact that so many people were on board with even willing to make these part of the governing framework of the state of California demonstrated the vast extent of this anti-Chinese sentiment by the late 1800s. The fact that people wanted to see this embedded in their framework of government speaks volumes. So those got shut down, but there were some federal restrictions placed that were successfully implemented. When I say successful, I mean they got carried out, not necessarily that they're anything positive. So first one we want to look at, the Page Act of 1875. This act specifically targeted Chinese women, all right? It restricted immigration of Chinese women to the U.S. by allowing U.S. immigration agents to ban the immigration of any Chinese woman who they suspected of engaging in prostitution. All right, so there's common stereotypes about Chinese women being involved with prostitution. We need to make clear, yes, there were, of course, women engaging in prostitution in Chinese communities, as there are in women of every ethnic group and every nationality. Prostitution is one of the oldest businesses in human history. Right? So, yes, they do have some women engaging in prostitution. However, there's common stereotypes that, oh, these are Chinese women, they're all prostitutes, they're just bringing diseases to the United States. So the types of things that immigration agents could use to determine that a woman must be a prostitute and therefore is not welcome into the United States could be anything as simple as her clothing style choices, maybe a woman immigrating alone, or not being able to prove that she had any kind of family connections in the United States. Oh, you're not coming here to meet up with a man? Well, then you must be a prostitute, right? These were the realities for Chinese women under the Page Act. They could be pulled out of line, taken to an office, interrogated, asked, why are you wearing what you wear? Why are you not here with the man? And then told, well, we assume that you must be engaging in prostitution and you're going to come spread diseases among the American people, so you are not welcome in this country. And this is pretty historically significant, right? We can say the Page Act is pretty historically significant because it demonstrated common American stereotypes about Chinese women by the late 1800s. Furthermore, it led to further restrictions on Chinese immigration. So we kind of see everything we need here, right, to write this as an ID term. We see what it was, or a federal act, what it did, restricted immigration of Chinese women suspected of prostitution for stupid reasons. Historically significant because it demonstrated one thing. Furthermore, we see that it led to another thing. So let's take that information, practice writing an ID term. I'm going to go ahead and use our common ID term format. In a second here, I'll let you guys go ahead and pause, go work on the next lecture activity, and you'll see in that activity that you have, once again, a template basically set up for you to copy and paste. All you got to do is fill in the blanks, and you'll wind up with a response that looks something like this. And all you're doing is plugging in the information you've learned about the Page Act from this lecture, all right? I'm not interested in what Google, ChatGPT, or whatever else has to say. Get your information from here. Show me you're paying attention. Show me that you managed to interpret that information and demonstrate your understanding of it in writing. All right. So go ahead and pause here and knock that thing out right quick. Earn yourself some credit and get some practice for the exam. Okay, so we certainly see very strict restrictions beginning to be placed on individuals of a particular ethnic group, more so as a basis of gender here under the Page Act. But this would get expanded upon quite a bit with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese Exclusion Act would actually ban all immigration of Chinese people into the United States. Furthermore, it would forbid any Chinese people already living in the United States from becoming citizens. So you can't sit there making that argument, well, they just should have done it the legal way. They tried and they were told you can't. This act originally placed these restrictions on Chinese people for a time span of 10 years, but then it got renewed again, and it was eventually made indefinite, meaning it would just go on and on. And this thing wound up lasting all the way until the 1940s, when the U.S. had China as an ally during World War II. And it looked a little rude to say, yeah, we'll depend on you for financial and military support, but by the way, your people are not welcome into our country. No, that's kind of rude, right? So at that point, the U.S. finally decided, hey, maybe we should stop doing this, and got rid of it. And there were some Chinese individuals who gave some kind of pushback to the restrictions placed on them under the Chinese Exclusion Act. Most prominent example we can see comes from a case known as U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. All right, so a little context here. Wong Kim Ark was a young man whose parents were from China, but he was born here in the United States. He had some family back in China, and he would pretty regularly travel back and forth between China and the United States. And at one point, while the Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect, he was stopped by an immigration agent as he was entering the country, and he told him, hey, you're not welcome here because you are Chinese and you are not an American citizen. And Wong Kim Ark said, this is a load of malarkey. I was born in the United States. He did his homework, and he said, under the 14th Amendment, I should be considered a citizen of the United States because I was born here. All right. And anybody born or naturalized in the United States for the 14th Amendment, regardless of race, ethnicity, etc., is a citizen of the United States, with an exception of American Indians. And the Supreme Court ruled in Wong Kim Ark's favor, right? They agreed that, yes, any individual born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, regardless of where their parents are from, right? This is pretty historically significant here. This led to protection of birthright citizenship for all children of immigrants born in the United States moving forward. I'll say that again. This led to protections of citizenship for all children of immigrants born in the United States, regardless of where their parents are from. And now there's some arguments about this in the 21st century. Guys, there's a firm precedent set here. This is what the authors of the 14th Amendment intended here. This case has already kind of cleared this mess up. It doesn't matter if his parents are immigrants. Being born in the United States, directly per the text of the 14th Amendment, protects this man's citizenship, as it does for all children of immigrants here in the United States. And unless there's ever another constitutional amendment that goes into effect, reversing what this amendment here states, that is the law of the land, all right? Any politician, any member of any state can say whatever they want to the contrary, but talk is cheap. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it states very clearly in the 14th Amendment, no matter where they're from, it doesn't matter if your parents are a bank robber, a member of a drug cartel. If you are born in the United States, you get a fresh start with the same rights and legal protections as anybody else born or naturalized here in the United States. I'm going to leave that at that. That pretty much wraps up Chinese exclusion here in the West Coast, as well as a little bit of resistance from individuals like Wong Kim Ark. Moving forward, we're going to move a little further inland and see what's going on in the same period in the Western Plains. I'll leave it there for now. Over and out.